Hello, everyone, and welcome to our compliance risks webinar for today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our compliance risks webinar. My name is Gustavo Morales Oliver. I am a partner at Marval, and I lead the compliance and investigations practice at the firm. I am glad to say that today I will have great company for this webinar. We are having our partners Pablo Gayol and Diego Fernández, as well as control risks members Jonathan Good, Stina Connor, and María Knapp joining us to discuss, as I said, compliance risks for the remainder of 2022. In case anyone is not familiar with control risks, this is an international consultancy firm with a global footprint involved in leading compliance matters. So the six of us will take about an hour to discuss key compliance risks for the remainder of 2022. We have structured this webinar into three sections. For the first section, Jonathan and I will be discussing in general the key risks that compliance is posing to companies globally. We will address some classics like corruption, as well as some new recent developments like, for example, the impact of the Ukraine crisis. Then we will have a second section in which we will discuss my new favorite in the compliance and investigations practice, which is cybersecurity risks, together with Diego Fernández and Stina Connor. And for the last part, we will take the third section to address ESG risks that will be handled by Pablo Gayol and María Knapp. So that being said, I hope you enjoy our webinar. Please feel free to ask any questions over the chat tool on the platform, and we will do our best to address those questions at the end of the webinar, obviously, provided that we have time. So for the first part, as I said, we are having Jonathan joining us from Control Risks. Jonathan is a lead analyst for the US and Canada. He has wide experience on geopolitics, governance, operational security, and integrity risks, advising companies in multiple industries. So welcome, Jonathan. We are truly happy to have you on board today, and we are eager to hear what you have to say on the main risks, right, for the remainder of 2022 in the compliance landscape, kind of combining, as I mentioned, some classics like corruption and some recent developments, right? Last year we had COVID. I don't know what you will say about COVID this year. It seems like there have been so many developments around the world, right? With crypto crisis, Ukraine crisis, and so on and so forth. So we are very glad to have you here. We are really eager to hear what you have to say on all of these topics.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. It is indeed, Gustavo, as you say, been a very eventful few years, especially for businesses operating in the Latin America, Western Hemisphere region and globally. They've faced a convergence of multiple overlapping crises, from the COVID pandemic right through to the Ukraine conflict, and now to a global energy, food, and other inflationary crisis. So companies really are grappling with a wide range of issues, and I look forward to discussing them this morning.
Great. So what do you think is the main topic, the first one you want to address? Is it Ukraine? Is it COVID? Have we forgotten about COVID? I mean, is it still impacting, compliance for companies on a global level, or is it something of the past?
Well, I think many countries, many companies, and certainly many people would like to forget COVID, but while most countries have lifted restrictions and started to move into a recovery from the pandemic mode, it's very clear that the pandemic is not over. cases have been rising worldwide with the spread of new variants, some of which elude pre-existing immunity or vaccination immunity. And this includes right across Latin America as well, where we have some of the fastest rates of increase over the last few weeks. And while this remains manageable for now, it continues to be disruptive. We've just come off a several-month period where significant lockdowns in parts of Asia were contributing to global supply chain disruption. Those have alleviated, but they haven't entirely gone away. Meanwhile, vaccination rates do vary globally. They vary within the Latin America region and in some cases remain relatively low. So this is a crisis that has become more manageable for many companies, but it is certainly not a crisis that has completely disappeared, and it hasn't erased some of the both duty of care and compliance obligations that companies are grappling with, let alone some of the more operational supply chain issues that continue to impact international business.
Absolutely. And I think there is also some kind of lagging effect with regard to some of the consequences of COVID, right? I mean, from a compliance practice, one of the risks that we see year after year coming as top of the list is corruption. And corruption related to COVID is, I would say, still beginning to be investigated, right? So whatever happened during this crisis that required some urgent measures, some reactions by many governments, triggering procurement programs that many times did not go through all of the usual checks and balances and procedures, would start triggering investigations by authorities around the world looking into potential fraud and corruption on again, the COVID crisis that on some aspect seems to be almost gone. I mean, authorities around the world start forgetting about asking for a vaccination when people travel, right? So in day-to-day life, it seems to be, going away. But when we look at companies and how they operate, it seems to be really present to this day and most likely will remain there for a few years to come. And what would you say about the Ukraine conflict? I mean, this is something that has been, I would say, unexpected for individuals, governments, companies. This has been the surprise that 2022 brought to all of us. How do you see companies reacting from a compliance point of view to the impact of the Ukraine conflict?
Well, absolutely. It has been a tremendous global shock, and it's contributing to and perhaps even accelerating some of the underlying trends around geopolitical fragmentation, global economic fragmentation that started way back with the global financial crisis 10 years ago, have gone through the US-China trade war and then the COVID pandemic, and now are being supercharged by the Ukraine conflict. I think the first thing to say is that the conflict in Ukraine is far from over. It's even intensifying as Russian forces make gains in eastern Ukraine and Western countries step up their military assistance and economic support of Ukraine. And so continuation and potential even escalation of the conflict over the coming months and beyond will probably compound some of these spillover effects that we've seen on both the global economy and international relations. So companies that have been buffeted by this combination of crises can probably expect elements of that to continue. And certainly one of the main drivers has been the way that the conflict, as well as some types of Western sanctions, have disrupted international supply chains or contributed to supply chain pressures and are driving, currently record food and fuel price inflation. This is squeezing economic growth. We've just had some very sharp downward revisions of the global economic outlook by the IMF and World Bank and major international banks and other observers on the back of this inflation. It is also, of course, feeding into social unrest and political instability in many regions, especially those regions that are heavily dependent on imported food and fuel. And that includes countries in Latin America where we've seen protests over the last few months.
Absolutely. And one of the topics that is kind of top of the list for 2022 that has been impacted by the Ukraine conflict is inflation, right? I mean, as you said, there are economic consequences for this situation, which, depending on which part of the world we are standing, it will be denominated a war or an invasion or whatever, but certainly, the effects are becoming global. I mean, this is not something that even a faraway country like Argentina can escape. It's not only about the price of food, but also about the price of gas. And none of this has an impact on how companies' logistical chains operate. And therefore, this brings new risks to the table. And one of the risks that has been kind of new to the world, but we are quite familiar with in Argentina, is inflation, right? I mean, how would you say that the world and companies are reacting to inflation in terms of how it affects their cash flows, how that affects their operations, and therefore their compliance risk, and how they are addressing this issue?
Well, one of the main things that we're seeing now is companies taking a strategic look at their business, both their business model and where they're operating, to manage this type of supply chain and inflationary risk. During the pandemic, of course, when we had very rapid and abrupt disruption of international supply chains, you'll remember, and this is still the case in some instances, shipping that was trapped in certain ports and couldn't unload, factories that had to shut down abruptly because of outbreaks of COVID cases. That's still a dynamic that goes on, but it got companies really thinking about what was the nature of their exposure to some of these international supply chain risks. And that carries with it, of course, where they're operating, the anti-bribery and corruption environments in those countries, the ESG environments in those countries, as we'll be talking about shortly. And it led to governments bringing an imperative in many cases, and especially for critical goods and critical sectors related to the health crisis. But we're seeing that expand more now to try to make those supply chains more resilient. And I think companies are really thinking about that word resilience in terms of how they can make their operations more durable to these types of global and geopolitical shocks. There are different approaches to doing this. At the very first instance, many companies are thinking about, well, what exactly does our supply chain look like? Who are our suppliers? Who are the suppliers of our suppliers? And where is there potential for disruption there? But we've also heard from companies that are looking at how can we optimize our supply chain, our production relationships, our customer and supplier base to make it more resilient to these types of shocks. In some cases, that means maybe moving or building out manufacturing operations closer to home or closer to core markets. We've certainly seen that in the Latin America region, where there's been a lot of interest in leveraging Mexico's proximity to the US, for example, for manufacturing operations. And the Ukraine conflict is encouraging this drive in some cases. It's really saying, if we're going to have a period of prolonged inflation, prolonged supply chain disruption, we need to figure out where and how we can reduce costs in that supply chain. But whenever a company takes a strategic step like that, they do need to consider those compliance risk issues about the landscape in which they're going to be operating, their counterparties that they're going to be operating, or joint venture partners that they're going to be operating with, and how that might change from what they're familiar with and used to.
And all of that should be done really quickly, right? I think that's another lesson that companies, particularly when dealing with compliance risks, have learned, especially, since COVID. For the past 2 years, we have had one crisis after another. So we had COVID, we had Ukraine, we have inflation impacting around the world. We have a crisis now with digital assets. And all of this is happening so quickly. I know digital assets is also one of your fields of expertise. What can you tell us about that?
Well, interest in these types of assets, and here we're talking about both cryptocurrencies, but also the underlying technology of blockchain that companies are gradually incorporating into their operations to manage certain aspects of supply chain or product quality management, asset tracing, auditing. This remains very high amongst both companies and governments. But exactly as you say, Gustavo, this is a very new and innovative spaces. And my colleague Stina could certainly talk about this in more detail. Companies need to monitor what is a very rapidly evolving legal and regulatory landscape around these types of assets. Not just the kind of day-to-day market volatility, but this includes areas like anti-money laundering, sanctions compliance. We've had a number of investigations here in the US. We've had the issuance of new guidance by the Securities and Exchange Commission, by the US Treasury around digital assets and how companies can bring these into existing KYC due diligence procedures, and how they can ensure that they remain compliant with all of their obligations even when dealing with this new and very innovative asset class. So there's going to be a lot of movement on this front in a lot of different countries. And, Latin America, of course, is one of the regions that is perhaps pioneering in how these are being deployed in the public sphere. So companies will need to pay close attention to that. The last 2 years of pandemic have been a very rapid period of digitalization for many companies, but I think we're going to see the compliance obligations begin to catch up with that in the coming year as well.
Absolutely. I think that catch up is the key element there, right? I mean, regulations often move much slower than companies and technology and business. And we see that advising, companies in the crypto and tech industries every day. It's usually a challenge to adjust modern operations to old regulations, but in the end, regulations will catch up. So being prepared to react fast, I think it's key. As you said, in crypto, in regard to sanctions as well, we saw 2022 coming up with a huge load of economic sanctions imposed by a number of countries, impacting compliance programs, and companies having to react very, very quickly. Understanding what sanctions are, what kind of exposure they have, who is exposed if I have a global group operating all over the world. Who is really exposed to those sanctions? Is it only the US legal entity or the Australian legal entity operating over there in Australia? Is it the whole group? And there are many misunderstandings in this regard. As with the corruption, it is the case that legal entities not directly subject to those regulations may be exposed for operating as an intermediary. So there has been a lot going on. It's been certainly a very active time, not only 2022, the beginning of 2022, but also 2021 and 2020 for the compliance industry. And moving on to kind of our next section today, and connected to the topics on digital assets that Jonathan was mentioning, I'm happy to bring on board Diego Fernández and Stina Connor to address cybersecurity. As I said, this is my new favorite. Diego and I worked together in a number of cases on this new trend that is here to stay. It's certainly bringing a lot of headaches for clients. We find it really fascinating and interesting because it brings challenges from all areas you can think of when it comes to the law that need to be handled together with IT issues, operational issues. So it can really get very, very complex. So when talking about cybersecurity and particularly cybersecurity incidents, right, we are talking about situations in which a company is under attack. The company is somehow hacked. There could be some ransomware, some data leaks. How should companies deal with all of that? And the first point that I want to bring to the table today is that a distinction should be made, and this is so important, between a quick reaction in terms of an IT response. Again, we are talking about a company that is under attack by some hackers, right? So the IT systems have been attacked. They have been somehow crippled. They may have turned completely, blocked or blocked in part. But reacting from an IT point of view will not cover everything a company needs to address, because there will be exposure under certain applicable regulations. This could be securities regulations requiring disclosure. There could be exposure under data privacy regulations. Diego is the expert here, but there could be reporting obligations to a number of authorities around the world because of data leaks. There will be questions asked by stakeholders. That includes clients, contractors, shareholders, and all of those questions and reporting obligations will be, in essence, asking about what happened, why did this happen, is it over, and what has been done to prevent this kind of situation from happening again. And most of the time, the kind of response that companies have immediately from an IT point of view to have the systems up and running again will not necessarily address these questions that are much better handled from the point of view of an internal investigation, putting together a proper team that understands the operations of the company, the legal needs in this scenario, as well as the forensics steps that have to be followed. And in an ideal situation, you will have all of this protected by attorney-client privilege. So first point, the point that I want to bring to the table, big distinction between an IT response and an internal investigations with proper forensics protocols and with attorney-client privilege protections in place. And as we say with Diego, addressing this kind of crisis is much easier when there is a proper response plan in place in advance. Diego, this is one of the topics that you like to talk about. What can you tell us about it?
Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here. So I totally agree with you, Gustavo. No surprise there, I guess. We know something that you need to have beforehand. It's better to have because many times you don't have it. It's an incident response plan that actually says what you have to do and who you have to work with just beforehand. Don't wait until you are hit with a cyber attack to see what to do. But I bring good news. I was hearing what you were saying, and I think you can reconcile both words between the IT trying to, because the business will say, I want to be up and running as soon as possible. I'm losing money every day. I'm not working, and then you have the other word, which is the forensics, which is probably what you will need in a long term because clients will ask, authorities could ask, and if you don't have the evidence to show what happened and what you did, you will be in a worse position there. So point number one, going to what you were saying, yes, absolutely have an incident response plan which covers what you have to do. And one thing that we see very often with you when we are dealing with these things is, and you mentioned that at the intro, make sure that you structure the relationship between the different vendors and the attorneys in different jurisdictions under the attorney-client privilege. That, of course, it could be different in every jurisdiction, but there are some common grounds around the world so that you as a company have the chance to, have control over what you learn from the investigation. You don't want to have to report and show every document that is produced on the basis of the investigation. And even depending on the type of incidents, you don't even want a report depending on what the outcome is. So make sure that you know what you're doing and you're working with people that know about that. And again, you were saying, Gustavo, and I would emphasize that you need to know what happened, what you did when you learned what happened, what measures you took immediately to remediate, mitigation measures. And then you will be asked probably in the future what long-term and medium-term measures you implemented so that the same incident doesn't happen again. That is very important. And that's where the IT vendor comes into play. Make sure that you don't do all the investigation and the forensic with your own team. I'm not here to say anything wrong about the internal IT teams, but maybe in some cases what they did or what they didn't do in terms of the systems of the company could be also part of the problem. So you want to make sure that you have someone who is an external provider that can be more objective if you want, and that could produce evidence that would stand before a court in case you need it. Hopefully not, but in case you need some evidence before a court or even to show to a client, you need to have a team there ready to help you.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more on all of those steps. So to avoid any repetitions here, let us give room to Stina. Stina, you are a leader with Control Risk Cyber Threat Intelligence team, and you have extensive experience in Europe, where you have seen a number of cases in which the points that we have raised with Diego come up, as well as some additional points. What can you tell us from your experience on how to properly address cybersecurity incidents? And I know you also have clear ideas on whether these are the kind of risks that are, let's say, seasonal as COVID, that at some point will disappear? Or are we having to face cybersecurity risks for many years to come?
Thank you very much, Gustavo, and Diego as well. Really interesting points, and couldn't agree more. As you said, so I think one of the additional points here, and perhaps worth bringing out, is one of the challenges we've seen within this kind of environment of what seems very much like a never-ending spiral of kind of acceleration when it comes to cyber risk. We're seeing more frequent attacks, we're seeing more severe attacks, and then of course COVID coming in with the kind of rapid digitalization that has brought to a lot of organizations, kind of now catching up with what digital assets they actually have. And then Ukraine kind of on top of that, obviously for us in Europe, very, very key for the cyber risk environment, but also certainly globally. But I think within all that, a lot of these global trends are trickling down and becoming very evident also in Latin America and other regions of the world, particularly when we talk about ransomware. And I think that's one of the key areas where having an understanding of how the risk environment changes is really critical to be able to design the appropriate response that you've spoken about here. If we look at ransomware, for example, which has gone very much from an operational IT focused piece of kind of encrypting devices, we now see ransomware threat groups exfiltrating data. So fundamentally, you now have a data breach, which carries with it additional legal and regulatory implications and obligations. We also, of course, have the kind of sanctions element to this. We see cyber threat actors increasingly being sanctioned by government entities. So adding that on top of the kind of puzzle of dealing with these incidents. And I think particularly what we find when we kind of support clients dealing with incidents is that there is much more onus on understanding who's actually behind the attack, understanding is this actually now a sanctioned entity, to then be able to tailor and respond to that effectively. So very much in line with the steps that kind of Diego outlined already around a much more concerted approach to dealing with these incidents. These are not just IT issues, they're not just isolated events that can be kind of handed off to one function. It is very much looking at, what are the legal implications? What are the regulatory obligations? What are the potential reputational impacts of a large scale data breach, for example, on stakeholders, on customers, on kind of shareholders and so forth. But just coming back to your final point there, Gustavo, certainly this is not something that we expect will be going away. We're not seeing any end really in sight. It is, from a criminal perspective, an extremely lucrative business model. I think we've seen that increasingly also in the Latin America region, where there is a perception around kind of lower cybersecurity maturity and controls compared to some of the markets in Europe and North America, which have been kind of hammered by a lot of these groups for some time. Criminals will take advantage of this. They will use past breaches. They will use malicious insiders or weaknesses in the IT supply chain to get in. And we've seen that in a number of high impact attack in the region as well. So certainly one really that will stay on our radar.
Absolutely. So, at least in my opinion, so long as we have technology, embedded in operations of companies, which is not likely to go away anytime in the future, these kind of risks will be there. So at least what we tell our clients with Diego is the best you can do is acknowledge that these are significant risks, because the potential impact of an attack is really, really high, and try to be prepared. And it's interesting for us, as a law firm operating in Argentina, how we see that this is not exclusive to attacks occurring or originating in Argentina, right? This can easily originate anywhere else in the world. Actually, we have seen cases originating, let's say, far away from Argentina, in a country far, far away, addressed at some other country and then impacting the operations of companies doing business in Argentina, kind of as a side effect, let's call it. So it's really easy. It's really easy to be under attack. It's much easier than companies really see. But it's so important to be prepared. Diego, any final comments you want to make on this topic before we hand it to Paula and Maria?
On top of what you were saying about the international approach that we need here, we have seen many cases working together in which, and coming from a data protection perspective, in which data was compromised, personal data was compromised all over the world. And then you have to take a very close look at what the notifications are triggered by a security incident. Those notifications can come from the law, can come from sectorial regulations specific to the industry in which you are, can come from the contract with your clients. So something to have in mind is have a good contract management, that beforehand you know who to notify what. And then something that we also see very, very often with Gustavo, when you have you do a data privacy or data protection assessment to who you have to notify, make sure that you put everybody who is participating in the investigation under the same roof, because sometimes a notification on a data subject authority, say in Europe, could have a lot of effects on what you are doing in the US or what you're doing in Latin America. So you want to make sure everybody knows what's going on. They're not silos, that everybody's working on their side. We need to be communicating, and that's part of the response plan. You need to know who you have to work with, and that's probably part of the success.
Absolutely. Stina, any final words?
No, I think the key message, I guess, is really to make sure that the kind of response plans, the management plans, reflect what actually happens out there in the risk landscape. Any new changes, these are quick, agile actors. They come up with new and inventive ways to target companies all the time. So making sure that all of those aspects are kind of revised and updated as needed really is I guess the key message from my side.
Perfect. Thank you both. So now moving into the third section of our webinar today, I'm happy to introduce Pablo Gayol, a partner at our banking department at Marval, who is leading our firm's ESG efforts. And María Knapp, she's a partner at the Compliance, Forensics, and Intelligence practice with Control Risks. I'm happy to have both of you to address a topic which actually I'm not that familiar with, which is ESG. So this time I will hand it to you, Pablo, so you can lead the conversation with Maria.
Thank you, Gustavo. And we would like to take a few minutes today to talk about ESG strategy and planning, how to integrate ESG analysis to the decision-making of the companies in order to reduce risks and avoid future problems. We all know that ESG factors are having an increased impact on the business of the company, their ability to grow, their ability to obtain finance. In the finance sector, where there are green bonds, but also financial institutions, multilaterals are increasing their ESG requirements in their loans. With mutual funds, we are used to mutual funds that have a negative screening for ESG factors, but increasingly there are ESG mutual funds that have ESG scoring, and they invest more on those assets that have a higher score, and they are developing proprietary ESG scorings in order to allocate their funds. In the acquisitions sector, there's an increased concern on ESG factors, and that aspect of the due diligence process is getting more relevance. Market access, we are seeing that with the European agreement with Mercosur, the importance that they're having in trade agreements, but also we are seeing border measures like CBAM, and so measures that the countries take to compensate for ESG discrepancies. Supply chain, there is an increase monitoring and due diligence on the supply chain to make sure that everybody complies with certain standards. So these matters have an increased importance on the business. But what we see is that in many companies that ESG factors are not in the radar, or they become in the radar because the investor relationship person gets questions from their shareholders, or they have to fill a questionnaire, and then, okay, we have to put some kind of response to that or strategy to that, or they have received a financing from ISC, they have done a lot of work for that, and they say, okay, why don't we take the opportunity to issue a green bond? So they have more a reactive and opportunistic approach to ESG than a more comprehensive approach. And these are companies that all their business are planning. There may be oil companies, logistic companies, mining companies. They don't run their business on reactive manner. So there is a need to have a policy that's integrated to the decision making, to have that in the decision making process, and have that tailored to your needs. You have to set what are your goals for that. Is you want to get financing from a multilateral, you want to issue a green bond, you want to sell beef or steel in Europe, you want to be part of a global chain of apparel. We have a company that now was trying to start a crypto mining business, and they think of having at some point an IPO. Well, how you source your energy it might be an important factor in the future. So what we think is that there's a need for having a strategy. There's a lot of legal work involved with that, mapping regulations, but also there's a lot of consulting work, because the key here is how you integrate all that into your decision-making process. And I think Maria has done a lot of work on that area, and it would be great if you can share that with us and share your experience a little bit with us.
Thank you so much, Pablo. I think it's very clear you've presented a lot of the challenges that kind of cause our clients to come to us for solutions. I mean, I think the fact that financing is ESG and financing can be a barrier to entry. It can be a barrier to financing. It can also, if you're doing it right, present you opportunities to much more favorable terms of financing. And I think you've set that out, really clearly, as well as some of the different sources of financing that might lead you down a different road in terms of your ESG strategy. So I wanted to pick up on that because I think it signals something else that we're seeing in terms of a trend on ESG, which is that there's not a lot of coalescence, there's not a lot of cohesion. So we've already mentioned a number of different financing instruments, for instance, that might take you down a different path. There's also an increasing number of standards and norms in the ESG and sustainability sector that might take you down a different strategy as well for creating processes and policies. I think what's important, though, is there is some increasing cohesion, thankfully, at least at the regulatory level. So I would say a couple of years ago, when it was the money taking the lead, principally banks, basically unbanking a lot of companies, and that's a trend that's continuing. It will become increasingly difficult to be banked without really adhering to very strictly just norms. But back when PE was starting to pay attention to this, it was incredibly difficult to figure out what standards am I supposed to meet, what norms am I supposed to meet. Now that the European Union has taken a really significant lead in setting out taxonomy around green and human rights, and instruments that underpin that on, for instance, disclosures, due diligence, etc., there is some normalizing, which is incredibly helpful. Some of the standards and norms as well that were initiatives have also been integrated into that. So when I think about the task force on climate related disclosure, TCFD, that's being integrated into a number of the regulations. It will probably be taken into account to what the Security and Exchanges Commission is doing in the United States as well. So that is becoming a little bit easier. But where there's a positive, there's also another challenge, which is that while that's happening, the goalposts are changing. So the TCFD team has initiated a new initiative around TNFD, NFD, which it looks broader than climate impact and looks to nature, nature positivity, and more of the positive impact on companies' interaction and impact on nature. So that's just kind of keeping the goalposts changing, which I think is keeping companies on their toes. We have seen, and we have done a lot of work looking with companies at how they can organize themselves around this from a kind of management structure perspective. And I've not seen two companies take exactly the same model. And in fact, we did a little bit of work with the Ethisphere, which is an organization that looks at this and set out sort of 4 potential models that companies could apply. And when we tested it with a dozen companies, each of them said they would go with a hybrid variation of any of those 4 models. So I think within the audience's own companies, they may find that there are different functions involved. And both Diego and Stina referred earlier to the fact that it's really important to understand which functions are involved and to have a really strong integration in order to manage issues and mitigate issues and respond to them. In the cyber realm, it's going to be much the same in ESG in order to actually implement a policy and a process and make sure that that's functioning properly. That coordination is going to be essential. We've seen what happens when that's not happening, when, say, investor relations is reporting something and then other functions in the organization aren't actually following suit or implementing. You get a situation like Deutsche Bank and DWS have found themselves being investigated by the German financial regulator, the BaFin, and now, again, fully from the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States for effectively misrepresenting their investments and now being pursued for prospectus fraud. So really, the head not speaking to the tail or vice versa in organizations can lead to quite significant repercussions. I think where we're seeing really constructive approaches to this is clients that understand and companies that understand that this isn't just an EU issue and it's not just a United States issue. We're talking about value chains. And in fact, a lot of the rules and regulations and standards and norms that are coming out are looking much more at not just even supply chains, but value chains. So that goes down to clients. But every market is affected by this. And it's not quite the same as the extraterritorial effect of, say, anti-bribery and corruption laws, but there is definitely an extraterritorial impact. And a lot of the work that we're doing with our clients connects, for instance, typically we'll be benchmarking them against their industry peers, then we'll be conducting a risk assessment with them to identify where their hotspots are. But really critically is companies that are able to connect whatever program they're building and whatever policies they're building with the realities on the ground. And again, Stina referred to the risk environment being absolutely critical to understand in the cybersphere. Well, it's exactly the same. The types of issues that we're seeing, for instance, in the work that we're doing in Latin America, in various countries in Latin America, it really involves field work. It involves being on the ground. It involves local experts. Many of the issues around ESG are very localized. So there are some things that you can do remotely, and which we do remotely, particularly on the environmental side, in terms of emissions, efficiency, and calculation. But when it comes to actually impact, that local element is absolutely key. And it is being reported to investors. It is being reported to, for instance, headquarter companies that may be situated elsewhere. And so it's really important to understand those 2 angles. I think, the sort of companies that we're working with are trying to look at E, S, and G as much together as possible. Well, that is a challenge because of what I mentioned earlier in terms of the different functions involved. But it can be absolutely advantageous to look across how environment and social issues are being incorporated with existing systems, programs, and policy frameworks. So, for instance, in the compliance world, we're seeing a lot of compliance officers and legal teams pick up on environment and social risks because they have these excellent systems that have been built and tested over the years, looking at third-party risk exposure. And in ESG, the third-party risk exposure is still one of the most significant. So it's a lot easier to control and change your own activities as a company than it is to go and influence your value chain and your supply chain, but that's absolutely essential. And in fact, the EU regulation on now related to both Scope 3 emissions, which looks at your full value chain, but also the new mandatory due diligence on human rights and the environment, which will set absolutely the international best practice standard on this, has components that impose an obligation on companies subject to that law to go and work with and capacity build and raise skills within their value chain in underperforming parts of their value chain that are high risk from an ESG impact perspective. So it's really a mindset shift. And I think really starting from a very practical standpoint. So, as Pablo said, understanding the legal and regulatory landscape is absolutely key, and having a good legal assessment on that, that's also forward-looking, forms the basis of what a lot of companies are doing, but combining that with an understanding of what industry and sector issues are critical, where you sit against your peers and the peers that you want to compare well with, in order to maximize not just attraction for investment, but also minimizing the operational impact on your company and trying to create a more positive impact on your other stakeholders. Building the right program that answers to those factors is really done, from the ground up. And using all the tools at your disposal to get there. So in some of the due diligence work, for instance, we're combining geopolitical analysis, policy analysis, field work, management interviews, site visits, community engagement, really anything that we can use to get at the heart of an issue and really pinpoint kind of cause and effect will build a much stronger program. And I'm very heartened to see a lot of activity around that in Latin America. And in fact, although it's, not where a lot of the global regulations are coming out, is certainly where we're seeing a lot of the most interesting projects and companies that are committing quite a lot to, run their businesses well, run their projects and assets well.
Well, that was a clear description of the trends and challenges in the ESG field. So we are reaching the final part of our webinar today. So I have a few questions for all of you, and I will ask each one of you to give some final words, right, to conclude your participation. So let me start in reverse order. So Maria, you're going to go first, okay? I really liked it how you addressed the fact that third parties are key in handling ESG risks, because that brings attention to a classic in compliance, which is third parties, right? That's usually where the main focus of energy and resources should be, provided that you have your own people, properly in line. So that being said, would you say that ESG is here to stay? Is it really a trend for the long term, or is it more like something of the moment that will simply fade away, a couple of years from now? What's your view from a global perspective on this?
Thank you. So I think the extent to which these kind of regulations and laws are being built, it would be very difficult to untangle as well from the financial system. So I think at this point, we've gone really too far down the road in the financial system to untangle what's going to happen. I think that certainly we're already seeing a lot of changes with financial instruments that Pablo may be able to answer to better. But, I definitely think that the momentum is building rather than declining. And I was reading this morning about the alignment of taxonomy between the EU and China on ESG, which for me and the carbon credit market that's being built in China will be the largest in the world. That's a momentum that really, it can't be turned around, I think. But with regards to third parties, what I'm seeing now is a lot of companies effectively kind of devolving the risk to their suppliers and sort of sending out questionnaires and effectively pushing their suppliers to comply. There's a real risk in that because not all suppliers and members of your value chain have the capability to do that. And so I think the trend that we'll see is a much more sort of hands-on approach and a much more involved approach in assuring strong performance and performance improvement throughout the value chain. And that's a bigger ask. So I think the nature of the activities will evolve.
Thank you, Maria. And Pablo, do you think ESG in Argentina is following international trends, or is it somehow detaching from the rest of the world? And on top of that, your final words to close your participation today.
I think we are a little bit behind, but as Maria says, two issues I think are key here. One is that many managers increasingly have a mandate to comply with ESG criteria. So money governs, and you will have to align to what the people who put the money wants. The second is, as Maria says, there are a lot of regulations in Europe and the States related to ESG, and it's increasingly clear that local producers will not allow foreigners to import products with a lower cost because they haven't followed those rules. So this globalization of an extraterritorial effect of local regulations will increase because of market access concerns. I think that, and we are seeing that with our products. Argentina is suffering that. So I will say this will stay, and this will increase in relevance in the future. It's something to be aware of, and decisions have to be taken today, having in mind 5-10 years in the future.
Excellent. That's also another recommendation that I often bring to the table, almost in any case we are discussing compliance issues, right? Decisions made today should not be made looking into how things have happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago. This is a typical type of analysis for corruption-related cases. Decisions should be made thinking on what will be done 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or 15 years from now. So thank you, Pablo. And let me ask Stina. Stina, you emphasized that cyber attacks and cybersecurity risks are not exclusively an IT issue. This is a comment on which Diego and I fully agree. So if you were to give companies, let's say 3 main recommendations on how to be well prepared to react properly in case of a cyber attack, what would those 2, 3, 4 recommendations, the key ones that you would bring to the table to companies in those cases?
Absolutely. Thank you, Gustavo. I think it's a big question. So I think, as I said previously, the really critical one is understanding all the different functions within the organization that may be impacted and that may need to respond in their own way, and making sure they speak to each other. I think another really key point, again, is around understanding what is actually happening in the threat and risk landscape. And this is, again, necessitate kind of engagement with functions that track these issues on a day-to-day basis, but making sure there is a reporting line up and kind of awareness around, okay, well, what does the landscape look like? What would it mean for us if we were to be subject to an attack tomorrow? Who needs to know about that, and how do we kind of mitigate against that? And then I think as well, just in terms of kind of preparedness and understanding that, yes, we see right now there's still heavy focus on parts of Europe, on North America, but these are kind of global trends. They will become the everyday across jurisdictions. So also learning from perhaps other parts of the organization that have dealt with this more on a day-to-day basis, making sure that you are kind of prepared to respond to these issues in both a secure and a compliant manner.
Thank you, Stina. Now moving on to Diego. Diego, I have seen you deal with notifications to data privacy authorities in multiple countries around the world for one single case, right? I mean, it can turn really, really challenging. What can you tell us about how to actually handle the reporting to data privacy regulators in cases of cybersecurity incidents?
Well, that's true, Gustavo. I could say that what you need to do, again, it's a little bit going to my prior comments. You need a good team. probably you would need local counsel in different jurisdictions. My experience is that it's a very good idea because sometimes the timeline that you have to notify, for example, a data breach, it's very short. It's a good practice to have a template response questionnaire in which you ask each of the jurisdictions what are the threshold to notify and who you should notify, what are the terms to comply with that, what type of data is considered personal data, or what type of incidents is actually considered a security incident that you have to report, because it's not the same in every jurisdiction. There are many jurisdictions in Latin America that don't even have data protection laws. So to have a good team which can answer and to have a good picture of what to do, that's what I would recommend. And if you want to be even better than that, it's good to have this beforehand. I would say that part of the compliance program that you should have in terms of data protection is to know if you are doing business in different jurisdictions around the world, or you're collecting data from data subjects around the world, it would be a good idea to have at least a summary, to have some flavor of what's going on in different jurisdictions in terms of notifications. So when the time comes, you already know, and you're a little bit ahead of what's going on, and that will help you a lot in terms of notifying.
Perfect. Be prepared and teamwork. Certainly the way to go. So thank you, Diego. And Jonathan, my final question to you. I mean, should additional economic sanctions be expected if the conflict in Ukraine remains active, or have we seen everything what was there to be seen on sanctions?
Well, we've certainly had the imposition of one of the most sweeping and significant sanctions regimes, and the only one in recent history against such a major economy as Russia. There is, of course, further ground that sanctions could address. This includes more comprehensive sectoral sanctions targeting some of Russia's major export sectors. We've had those introduced in a partial manner, but it's possible that in the event of escalation of the conflict, such sanctions could be introduced. But the other issue is really going to be around enforcement of the existing sanctions and how much and how willing Western countries are able to do this, not just in their own jurisdictions, but in terms of putting formal and informal pressure on other countries around the world to comply with and adhere to these types of sanctions. We've seen some threats that the US might, for example, impose so-called secondary sanctions for countries that were actively circumventing or undermining the sanctions regime. So this is very much an area that companies will continue to need to monitor over the coming months, not just the full scope of sanctions, but also how they're being enforced, and if Western countries feel the need to enforce more actively and aggressively in third-party jurisdictions.
Thank you, Jonathan. So as we have seen in this 1 hour webinar, we have almost perfect timing today, which is kind of surprising. But we have seen we are facing a complex landscape in terms of compliance risks for companies operating internationally. But it's also true that with the proper know-how and tools, and going back to Diego's words, if possible, being prepared and having the right team in place, these challenging waters can be adequately navigated. So as my final words in terms of tools to keep in mind, I think that internal investigations are a great tool for companies to clarify uncertainty and make much better informed decisions. And within that realm of internal investigations, attorney-client privilege is a protection that all companies should at least consider in all of the scenarios we have been discussing. So that being said, thank you everyone for having joined us for this Compliance Risks webinar, and we look forward to seeing you all again in the next Marval Live Talks. Thank you so much.